Okay, Matt, like you say, lucky to be in the sport as prominently as you are without a horse races background. So where did that interest come from?
Well, it will have come from my mum, who is, I'll probably get this wrong, she's either 80 or 85 now, one of those two. But anyway, she's old. But she will have a bet every day still. She'll have nothing much. You're talking probably, I imagine she spends between a fiver and tenner every day. But she walks down to her local bookie. She goes through the doors. She writes her slips. She has a relationship with the staff. And she looks forward to that every day of the week. And she, funny enough, she's not one for modern technology, and she would watch Sky Sports racing on her iPad. So I've bought her all Sky Glass and everything, so she can watch it on the big screen and everything. And she absolutely loves watching the racing in the afternoon. At her age, it's her absolute hobby. But that's where I would have got it from. I remember going to Fontwell and Sandown very early days. I was brought up in a place called West Byfleet, which isn't far from those tracks, particularly Sandown, of course, sort of Esher way, Walton-on-Thames way. And I went to one of them. I remember watching Champions in the cinema in Esher. And I remember they played some music halfway through, like someone came up through the floor. Champions, the movie, doesn't seem that long ago, but it obviously just shows you how long ago it was in the 80s sort of thing. But I loved the sport. And I know that from the age of 10, I was recording, and I know this because I've got the tapes, I recorded every single race that was on TV on VHS. And after a few years, I cut down from recording every race to just recording the last couple of furlongs, because to be honest, you use up a lot of VHS after a while. I've still got all the tapes, and I still watch those tapes on and off throughout a year, so that my mind is constantly reminded of everything that went on in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, until I started working in the game. So that if a trainer of a certain vintage says something about an owner, I've got in my mind, yes, I can remember Bob Batt winning that race at Newmarket as a flat horse, and now he's a jump star. Or I can remember Lester Piggott nipping through a gap at Goodwood on Vacam and getting a suspension and losing his retainer with the Wildensteins. And I only remember that because I watch those races consistently. For me, it's like a child revising for an exam. And yes, you've got Google these days, but to use Google, you've got to know what to look up. And if you don't have that in your mind, in fact, I used it very recently on a situation with a live call at Chester, where I was about to talk to John Gosden about his horse in the classic trial that was running for his missus. And I knew that, or at least I thought I knew, that Jack Hobbs had won at Wolverhampton, which was what this horse had done. But I had no Wi-Fi. And so I said to my producer, I'm sure Jack Hobbs won at Wolverhampton in a novice or a maiden or something. Can you look it up? And he looked it up, and he had done it. But the only reason that I knew that was because I constantly remind myself of those things. And if you don't have that knowledge in your brain, Google's no use to you to look up Jack Hobbs, that's the point I'm trying to make.
Is it ongoing? Are you an avid form student now?
I mean, if you're going to ask me 5 questions of where did so-and-so last run, I'd probably get them wrong. But I look, avid form student, I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that for me, the most useful, the absolute 100% number one key to anything to do with horse racing is watching the races. And I watch less races now than I used to do. There was a time when if I missed a race, I'd feel almost physically sick. Now, I watch a lot less racing than I used to. And partly just because I've been spoilt in my jobs, because I work with a lot more good racing, and it's hard to trawl through a card of Class 6s, although I do work on a lot of Class 6 cards. But I would watch less now than I used to, which is bad, but that's just the way it is.
Okay, right, going back a bit further, you went to Radley College, which I'm told is a pretty exclusive education.
It's one of the best.
So, was school a happy time? Was it?
I love school. I went to boarding school from probably about the age of 6 or 7. I had music school. My dad was a music historian. He was Dr. Chapman. Wrote his thesis on the history. I think it was the history of pantomime music in the 18th century, and he was the only person in the world who knew anything about it. No one else had even heard of it. So When it came to marking his thesis, I think he almost marked his own because there was no one who could actually comment on whether anything he'd written was any good. He's been dead a very long time now, my old man. He never saw me on telly, got cancer, and it's a constant sadness in sunny ways because so I had music scholarships, which why I ended up at boarding school, and the only reason my parents couldn't afford any of the schools that I went to, but they made sacrifices to get me to a certain place because I got half fees at all my schools. And funnily enough, I dug out the slip from Radley just the other day because I was going through a box of old stuff, and I thought I got half fees at Radley, but I actually only got a third fees. But I noticed at the bottom they said, we'd like to offer you a third fee scholarship, but we know this will make it tough for your parents, so we're also giving you a bursary to make it up to half fees. So I wasn't some sort of multi-millionaire son who was just being handed everything. But I did music and I loved sport, and I was quite good at some sports, particularly racket sports. But I played rugby to a reasonable standard, cricket to a reasonable standard. I played racket sports to a good standard, and fives, which is a very public school game, but quite a hardcore game, which is a glove and a very hard ball and a lot of running into walls. I got to the final of the public schools championship. I was pretty good at that. And got absolutely whipped. Well, not actually whipped in the final, but I should have been whipped. But I was quite a terrier, and I managed to survive longer than I should have done. But anyway, so that's how I went to a good school. But I watched racing all the time, and I was constantly in trouble. At Radley, they were constantly trying to get my scholarship taken away from me. Not in trouble in a bad way, but I was mischievous. Like nightclubs in Oxford all the time. Radley's in Abingdon, which is just outside of Oxford, so we were constantly going to Oxford. Anyway, in the end, I could have gone to Cambridge on a scholarship, but I didn't get the grades to take it up, and I would have had to have retaken a grade, and I didn't want to do that. And so I went off and got a degree in London and went and worked on the independent newspaper for my last year. John Cobb, who you now see on the Racing Post, he was in charge. I wrote to every single newspaper. Independent was the only one who responded. And for about a year, in my final year of my degree, I went in and subbed cards. There was not much on international racing then. I wrote like French 10 to follow for the Independent. No one had done that. No one was writing about foreign racing. I wrote about the Greyhound Derby in the Independent. And can you imagine even getting a word on the Greyhound Derby in the Independent now? But I got 3 paragraphs in about the Greyhound Derby. And I was learning with some of the best journalists in the business. Paul Hayward, who's now, of course, top football journalist, now back writing a bit about racing again. Greg Wood, who everyone would know, still writing about horse racing. Richard Edmondson, who was a very good racing journalist. And I was in that mix, learning from the best. No pay, just going in every week, living this fantasy of being able to do something with horse racing.
So horse racing was on your horizon right from very early.
I mean, all I thought about was racing. Yeah, I was watching it and loving it every minute.
Okay, now when you got a degree, then you got a job at the Racing Post.
Not quite. So this is where the good school bit does come. So my best friend at Radley was a guy called Charlie Broom, who actually does quite a lot of work, I think for BBC, but independently as well. He can be heard on the radio for the Olympics and stuff like that. But anyway, his godfather was a guy called Desmond Stoneham, who was a director at the International Racing Bureau in Newmarket and also wrote all the foreign copy for France in the Racing Post at that time. And at that time, there were 4 people in the editorial department of the International Racing Bureau. A director was leaving, and that meant 3 were moving up and there was room at the bottom. And literally, without a day either side, Desmond rang me up and said, "Hi Matt, I know you've always loved horse racing. I've been horse racing with Charlie and his family. I know you've loved horse racing and I know you can write. Would you like to come and be the 4th member of the editorial department in the International Racing Bureau?" Well, I mean, I just said yes, didn't even need to think about it. No pay was even discussed. Went to live in Newmarket for 2 years. If you want a very quick story, quite fun, for almost first time, Vintage Crop won the Melbourne Cup. And myself and James Fry were in the editorial department. And you have to remember at this time, we were writing all the copy on foreign racing in both the Racing Post and the Sporting Life. All the copy came from that building, the International Racing Bureau. It didn't come from correspondence dotted around the world like it does now, and people, on their phones. There were no phones. There were no computers as such. We had almost like a ticker tape thing. It was like something out of an old movie. Anyway, almost my first job was Vintage Crop's Melbourne Cup. And we had a reporter who would feed us back things via this sort of ticker tape thing. Because, as I say, there wasn't a mobile phone. Obviously, we had normal phones. He decided not to go because he didn't think that the Europeans could win the Melbourne Cup. So he stayed in Sydney. And obviously, Vintage Crop won the Melbourne Cup. And all hell broke loose. The Sporting Life wanted the first 6 pages, the Racing Post wanted the first 6 pages. And here's me and James in Newmarket. We haven't seen the race, remember? We've got no reporter at the race, and all we've got is very limited communication. And we wrote all of it without ever having seen the race. So all the coverage of of Vintage Crop winning the Melbourne Cup was written by me and James Fry, having never seen the race. But I hated Newmarket. I begged the Racing Post for months and months and months and months and months to give me a job after I'd been there 2 years. And eventually, Alan Byrne, who was in charge then, gave me a job. And he often quips that it was the most, ridiculous, worst decision he'd ever made in his life, but it kind of worked out for everyone.
Why did you hate Newmarket?
Because it was full of either very rich people or very, very poor people. And as I've probably kind of described, I was kind of a little bit in between. We were nowhere near rich, but we weren't penniless. My dad taught, and my mum worked a bit. We were living a perfectly reasonable life. I don't want anyone to think we couldn't put bread on the table, but my parents were making a lot of sacrifices all through my life now, which is why I help my mum out. My dad's been long dead, but I help my mum out now as much as I can. I give her money every month. I do everything I can for her because I know the sacrifices that she and my dad made for me. It just wasn't for me. And also, you have to remember, I came from nothing. No one, who the hell is this bloke? What's he trying to do talking about racing? People do not respect you much. Not at all, really. If you haven't been a trainer or a jockey or an owner, you don't know anything about racing. That's the feeling, isn't it? That's the general feeling. How can you know about this sport? And that's what people felt. So I had no one to go out with. And all my friends from my school days were up in London. I was going to London every weekend whenever I could. It just wasn't for me. Funny enough, I think if I went there now, it would be a very different experience because people now who live there have grown up with me. And so maybe I would be considered part of the community, which is crazy because really I'm just as far away from the community as I've ever been. But that's life, isn't it? It's a different world now. I walk down the street in Newmarket now and mostly people are nice. And coming back to your very first question in our first section of this, the 50-50 thing I don't think is true really anymore. I don't get much abuse. Now maybe I'll get more now if people don't think I'm getting enough. I would say it's more 90-10. Now I'm not saying that 10, 15 years ago it wasn't 50-50, it probably was. But the Marmite thing I think it's kind of old hat. It's really? For every person who says a nice thing, does someone else say a horrible thing? No.